Hello, Health Science 3202 students. This is your first actual lecture. I've already given you one video on the syllabus and talked a little bit about the special assignment, so make sure you have an understanding of that. This is actually your video for Thursday, so if you're watching this, make sure and watch it, at some point during this week. If I post the videos, you don't have to watch them at any specific time, but I really do want you to keep up with them as you move through the weeks. So make sure and do so that way you don't fall behind in the course. Now I'm going to try and keep these videos at right around 30 minutes roughly, but I do apologize if I go much beyond that, because I'm going to give you the overview of the PowerPoints and tell you what to focus on, what's really important, and then hopefully these will be a guide as you are looking through the PowerPoints themselves. So I'm going to kind of keep you apprised of what slides we're on as we move through this first lecture. So this is environmental occupational health, and we're going to kind of just go ahead and jump into slide 2. Slide 2 is an overview of different kinds of environmental and occupational hazards. Obviously, when we talk about occupational hazards, we're really kind of focusing on chemicals, physical hazards, psychological hazards potentially, but certainly you can have an earthquake that has a massive effect on your work. So I used to work for a management unit for a large insurance company, and when we would have wildfires, it would radically change the work that we would end up having to do on a daily basis. So while we're going to be talking about these as occupational hazards and environmental hazards simultaneously, I definitely want you to kind of keep that in mind, that what you face in occupational setting is generally going to be very different than what you're going to face in an environmental setting in the standpoint of the scope of what you're actually facing, okay? So with environmental occupational hazards, you can have natural hazards like earthquakes, floods, and winds and things like that. So if you're a teacher or a student at Cal State San Bernardino, you understand that winds can be very dangerous. We also have biological hazards, things like animals, insects, microbes, things of this nature. So when we talk about biological, you really think about like mosquitoes being the most dangerous biological entity on the planet, killing more people than any other living organism. So definitely a lot of hazards in regard to biological components. But when we're talking about occupational hazards, certainly these are things that can affect you. And I've worked with a lot of biological agents over time, so these are things that can be considered when you do a risk assessment for an organization. From a chemical standpoint, lots of things going on. So say for instance I clean my oven with Easy Off and I stick my head in the oven, probably not the best idea. I'm going to get a massive dose of chemical exposure. But if I'm working, there possibility of being exposed to a lot of different chemicals at work. So certainly if you were a chemistry teacher at Cal State San Bernardino, you could be exposed to acids, bases, chemicals that could be very hazardous. On my job, I work with something called triethylamine, which is a teratogen, which means that it can cause birth defects, can be very dangerous. So there are a lot of chemical hazards. Lots of physical hazards depending on where you work. You could have things like heavy vibrations. You might actually work with radioactive materials, and certainly heat and cold as well. So if you work at a place where you're consistently outdoors, like working for Caltrans, heat can be very dangerous as well, and certainly can be a problem. Psychological stress, boredom, and anxiety. I'm sure a lot of you are feeling that right now with the start of the new quarter. Can be a real challenge, right? As a student, you're facing these things. And you can think of being a student as an occupation right now. As hopefully for some of you, this is a full-time job. But I know most of us, as we're going to school, we're working 2 jobs sometimes, trying to balance family life and things of that nature. And that can generate great anxiety. So from an occupational standpoint, yes, there's a lot of anxiety and stress and boredom at times, but in the environment as well. So we're facing this personally and professionally. And then sociological, you may have overcrowding, or you could be at great distance if you live in Nebraska or parts of Texas, places like this, certainly Alaska, places where there's a great deal of stress from being alone. Here in California, we're facing the opposite with overcrowding. But if you work in a facility that is very crowded and bustling, that can be a problem as well. On to slide 3. So with slide 3, you look at the little note on the side. The slide is focused on occupational safety, but these can also apply to the environment as well. So we're actually, this is an overview slide, and we'll kind of work through these one at a time. So on to slide 4, chemicals can be mutagenic, which means that they mutate cells, things like tobacco smoke and things like that. They can be teratogenic, causing birth defects, certainly thalidomide, which caused the phocomelia or seal limb condition. If you've taken my class, these are going to be familiar terms to you, but definitely something you can look up. Go to Wikipedia, you'll find all kinds of information. Go to a peer-reviewed journal, you'll find a lot better information, but I like to try to minimize your reading as much as possible. But if you're interested in these things, make sure and check it out and take a look. Retin A, the very first question they ask you is, are you pregnant? And a lot of physicians would actually test to find out if you were pregnant before they would prescribe you Retin A, because it is teratogenic and that it causes birth defects. They can be carcinogenic, like acrylamides. So when you go to a restaurant, you may see that there's a Prop 65 warning, because when you make French fries, obviously the potatoes are not carcinogenic, the oils themselves are not carcinogenic, but a byproduct of that cooking is something called acrylamide, which can be carcinogenic. Chemicals can also cause burns, physical hazards, they could cause respiratory issues, and they can be highly acidic or bases. So chemicals, from a chemical standpoint, can be very dangerous to health and safety. And generally, these are things that you're going to run into in an occupational setting. Certainly, if you work in electroplating, you're going to be around cadmium and things like this. If you work in a water treatment plant, you may be exposed to high quantities of alum. But lots of different things. And we'll explore these topics more thoroughly as we get into the semester. So today is really kind of designed to give you an overview of some of the things that we're going to be looking at. So slide 5 gives you an image of just some mutagenic chemicals, and these are things that can cause mutations. So obviously you see the hot dog there. Again, hot dog is going to be processed with nitrates and things like that can be carcinogenic. Cigarette smoke is going to have a ton of chemicals that can be potentially mutagenic. And that's one of the reasons that when you're on campus, you can't smoke near entryways. It's designed to protect people from these mutagenic chemicals. Teratogenic chemicals on slide 6. Lots of stuff going on here, and these are all things that can potentially cause birth defects. If you look at the right side, you'll see thalidomide on there, but there are also viruses as well that can be teratogenic. So it's not just purely these chemicals. There are lots of things that can cause birth defects. Physical harm, this is slide 7. So I really focused on the routes of exposure here. So how are you going to get exposed to these chemicals? It could be through dermal exposure, contact to the skin. It could be from removing gloves improperly. It could be from it being directly splashed onto you. But you also have ingestion and inhalation as well. These are all routes of exposure to chemicals. So from an ingestion standpoint, you can imagine you get chemicals on your hands, you touch a sandwich at lunch, you didn't wash your hands, you eat that sandwich and you ingest it through that process, or you could actually accidentally swallow this. Somebody puts an ill-marked container on the counter and you think it's your sweet tea, you pick it up, you drink it, and it turns out to be some horribly toxic chemical. And you also have inhalation. So there's a lot of inhalation going on with vapors and fumes. Certainly, if you've stood over gasoline, you can smell it very strongly. When you're smelling chemicals, that's a good indicator that you're taking them into your body, and these can have negative effects on the human form, especially if you have respiratory conditions. So if you're breathing in gasoline and you can smell it, that could be a problem. Now, one of the things that I always thought was interesting is when you're driving down the freeway, sometimes you'll be driving 70 miles an hour and you'll notice that you can smell certain kinds of smoke. I've noticed this with tobacco smoke, driving down the freeway at 80 miles an hour, and I've also noticed it with marijuana smoke as well, that you can smell it. If you can smell it, you're breathing it in, and that's an exposure through an inhalation process. So slide 8 shows a chemical burn. This is another thing, you get exposed to a acidic or very basic chemical, and it can have very negative effects on the human form. We'll move on to slide 9 with particulate matter. With particulate matter, this was another section of the overview slide, the black slide, that said that dust is bad for you. We're going to talk a little bit about particulate matter. So certainly, if you work in a setting where you're breathing in a lot of dusts from cutting wood, like a wood shop or a sawmill. It's very noticeable that a lot of these workers developed nasopharyngeal cancer from breathing in that dust. But particulate matter is particularly bad for people that have COPD, bronchitis, asthma, things of this nature. So this can be a real problem when exposed to particulate matter. And this is an environmental exposure. It's definitely an occupational exposure as well. So you've got that crossover. If you live under a freeway, you can potentially get exposed to a lot of particulate matter that's coming off of those vehicles and from the roads themselves, but certainly in an occupational setting as well, where you're being exposed to lots of different things. Like, say, for instance, you drive a specific land grading piece of equipment, or if you work on applying tar to rooftops, things of that nature, these can be problematic and having particulate matter drawn into the body. You could even think about like mesothelioma, where you're breathing in essentially what are particles of a natural substance, asbestos. This is a natural substance that appears in the environment. And if you were exposed to these things, you'd be exposed to the particulate matter therein, and it can be very dangerous. On to slide 10. How does particulate matter enter the body? Pretty straightforward here. You can read this slide and look it over. PM 2.5 is specifically dangerous. This is the size of the material itself in width. So 2.5, PM5, PM10. These are the things that can potentially be problematic, but PM 2.5 is most dangerous because you breathe it in, and the natural mechanisms that are designed to stop it, like the ciliary ladder, nose hairs, things like that, the cough reflex, will not stop PM 2.5 and will end up getting into the lungs and the alveoli and could potentially cause problems. And we'll definitely talk more about that down the road as well when we talk about air quality. On to slide 11. These are sources of particulate matter, and you see that dust is very high. This is one of the reasons that we are now paving the sides of freeways and things like that and putting rocks down. But this is also the reason that we used to plant oleanders and ground cover along freeways, because dust is really so dangerous. But you've probably driven past a site where they're working, and it says, if you see dust coming from this facility, call this number. And that's the reason, because it is an environmental hazard that can be problematic for individuals actually breathing that dust in. So this is an overview of sources of particulate matter, and you can see that dust just dominates even over fires. But certainly here in California, in specific times of year, fires can be very dangerous and will produce a large amount of particulate matter. Slide 12 is a fancy art slide that says fumes. So slide 13 shows some of the fumes that you can potentially breathe in. First is someone vaping, then you see a smokestack, and you also see a person painting, and you see vehicles next to that. These are all sources of fumes that can be drawn in through the inhalation process, and certainly I encourage you to avoid these as best as possible, especially when you're in a working environment. This is one of the reasons that a manager and an organization will always provide personal protective equipment. We'll call those PPE, and these are generally going to take the form of a NIOSH labeled respirator system. It could be just a filter, a paper filter, or a different version of that specific style of keeping vapors, fumes, particulate matter from entering your respiratory passageways. So on to slide 14, we'll discuss noise a little bit. So you can look at the graphic on the right-hand side, which shows some of the sources of noise and where they fall. So with Cal OSHA, the standard for noise is 85 decibels, permissible exposure level for an 8-hour shift. So that's a time-weighted average, TWA, which says that yes, you can be exposed to 100 decibels earlier in the day, but you have to make accommodations for those individuals so they're not exposed to large amounts of sound throughout the entirety of the day. And if you look at what 85 decibels is, you're essentially looking at heavy traffic and noisy restaurants. That's about 85 decibels, and that can cause something called a temporary threshold shift. You can imagine when you go to a concert and you hear ringing in your ears afterwards. That's that temporary threshold shift. You can have permanent threshold shift if you're exposed to these things for long periods of time. If you went to a rock concert every day, obviously you would probably lose a good portion of your hearing by the time you reached a certain age. But you can take a look at the noise on the right-hand side and essentially what you're looking at. Now, something to remember with the decibel scale is it is a logarithmic growth scale. Much like like the Richter scale. So if you're talking about a 1 versus a 5, you have to remember that that's exponential growth in regard to how this is going to affect your hearing and affect the percentage of noise that you're actually taking in. So like when you have 50 decibels, that's like a quiet office. You jump up to 80 decibels, that's noisy traffic. You get up to 180 decibels, and that's going to be a rocket launch, like right in your face. And then 160 is like a shotgun blast. So these are very loud. That logarithmic growth scale is important to remember. On to slide 15. This is an ergonomics slide. This is actually something that's very important from a standpoint of hazards within the workplace, because you probably know someone who had carpal tunnel syndrome. This is very common for us with typing, but I knew a bartender that had carpal tunnel because they were always doing the same motions with their arms, wrists, hands, things like that. So this is a very important area to consider. From an ergonomic standpoint, you look at the right side top box. You want to design the work environment so that people don't have to do a lot of things that can cause ergonomic stress on themselves. And you can see that posture is very important, but lifting and twisting, carrying a box is very dangerous for your back, and that's usually where you're going to have problems. So say for instance I work at a processing facility moving packages, and I have to pick that box up and turn and set it somewhere else. That motion repeatedly is going to cause me back problems, and it's going to be problematic in the future. So ergonomics is very important. On to 16, biological hazards. You could have exposure to animals, plants, microbes, things of that nature that can be potentially problematic. So say for instance I work at a zoo and I work around animals. That's an obvious example, but how about working at a landfill where birds are flying all over the place and potentially affecting issues that I may have. There could be flies that are mechanically vectoring things, so a fly lands on a piece of fecal matter or garbage, picks up some bacteria and then lands on my sandwich. I eat that. That's a biological hazard on the workplace or in personal environment as well. And certainly microbes can be an issue, which is why we focus on sanitation in restaurants and things like that so heavily, because we want to make sure people are safe from these things. On to slide 17. This is a list of biological hazards. So obviously a very detailed list in just some of the bacteria, and certainly not very detailed in regard to some of these other biological hazards, like say for instance flies or mosquitoes or things of that nature, including larger animals as well that could be problematic from a biological standpoint. And you can also put plants in this list as well. So if I work in an area where I'm readily exposed to things like poison oak, that could be a problem. And certainly when poison oak is burned and breathed in through an inhalation process, it can be very deadly for individuals that breathe that in. And bees, in addition to that, there are lots of different things that fall into this category of biological hazards that you may potentially experience. On to slide 18, we're going to start looking at some work-related exposure for some physical means through extreme temperatures. This is a really great slide, so I encourage you to read it over because it has both hot and cold simultaneously side by side. This is slide 18, and it really gives a good idea of some of the occupational issues. So we're going to talk about risk assessment a couple times in the semester. Risk assessment is really important to understand, and it's something that I focus on with my staff. As the summertime approaches and really starts to drive up the heat, it's very important that my workers are safe, that they understand the symptoms of heat stroke and heat stress and prolonged heat exposure and what it can actually do to you. So this is something that I always focus on with my staff. Now, if you live in potentially the Midwest or Alaska, places like this, you can experience extreme cold. So you can imagine a person who does ground control for airplanes at Chicago O'Hare Airport, where it gets well below, well below 30 degrees below zero. And if I'm standing outside with a little light telling planes which way to go, I can be exposed to extreme cold. And there are a number of ways that you can be exposed to cold. Obviously, that's a very rudimentary example for that. On to slide 19, vibrations. You have two types of vibration that can affect you in the workplace, and there are variables therein. You might be exposed to both these vibration types simultaneously. Hand-arm vibration comes from generally using power tools, but you also have riding in heavy equipment. So think about this. If I am a bus driver and I'm driving an older bus that doesn't have a seat, that it does a very good job, and the steering wheel is vibrating nonstop, I could be experiencing both of these as simultaneously as two types of vibration that can affect me in an occupational setting, but it can also affect you in the environment as well. So this is another example of a physical hazard. And on to slide 20, which is natural disasters. Earthquakes, floods, wildfires, tsunamis, hurricanes, tornadoes, volcanic eruptions. I mean, this is just a small list of potential natural disasters. I mean, think about mudslides and how they can affect an individual. So say, for instance, I'm working on a dam project and the ground lets loose, or I'm working in a mine and there's an earthquake and the whole of the mine shifts and traps a group of individuals. These are all very dangerous natural disasters that can occur. So again, that's it for the slides for lecture 1. But I just really want to emphasize the fact that this is an overview of what we're going to be talking about as the semester goes on. These are things that we will talk about in more detail. So this is kind of a lecture that's designed to give you an overview of some of the topics we're going to discuss. Now, obviously, there's still a lot more we're going to talk about. We'll talk about things like water quality. We'll talk about air quality, but we'll certainly do our very best to always tailor that towards not just the environmental piece, but the occupational piece as well. How does the environment affect my occupation? And certainly very important. So it wasn't that long ago that the question essentially was raised to say, oh, you have this condition, you have COPD from years of exposure. What was your job? These are fairly new concepts. When we started looking at people that had repetitive motion syndrome, like carpal tunnel, we might have just said as a physician, oh, well, you have this, we need to fix it, or you need to live with it, or put these wrist braces on for the rest of your life. It wasn't that long ago that the question was developed to say, okay, what do you do? How did you get this? And starting to look at that process and saying, maybe institutions and organizations that are providing us with gainful employment also have to provide us with a work environment that is safe. And that is a very critical piece. And it's something that I want you to keep in mind, that we can't just essentially say it's okay for us to do whatever we want to our workers. It's very important as a manager and as a worker to make sure that you are protected. So with my respirators that I use on the job, I have to change them every day, whether I use them or not. That's the standard. But essentially, do I do that? Sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. But it's the onus of the worker. I've been trained on how to change my respirator. I've been shown where those respirator cartridges are. And if I don't change them out on a regular basis, I've signed a document that says that I understand that process. So now, the a lot of the negligence falls on me as an individual employee. And that's an important thing to remember, that in an organization, we do everything we can to protect our workers from hazards in the environment, and we want to keep them safe. Replacing a worker is the last thing you want to do. And finding out that you were the cause of why a worker became sick or injured is the last thing that you want. It can be very challenging and very problematic to deal with. You want your workers to be healthy. You want them to be happy. And that's what we really try to do from an occupational setting. And certainly, I hope that a lot of my students go on to be managers. And you want to be able to provide your workers with a safe working environment that is free from hazards that will cause their lives to be shortened in any fashion. I know for me, I just can't imagine missing out on one day of my life because of something that happened to me while I was at work. So that's one of the takeaways. But again, lots of things to be talking about, lots of topics for us to dig deeper into. Now, I sincerely hope that you watched this video. If you made it to this point in the video, I know you watched it. I'm grateful for that. I will be watching, so I'm going to be posting these videos on YouTube where I can get metrics on how many people have actually watched these videos. And if I get down to where there are only like 1 or 2 people in the class that are watching the videos, I will stop making them and assuming that you're really just focusing on the PowerPoints. But I'm always here to answer questions. And if you enjoy the videos and if you watch the videos, if I get 5 students that are watching the videos, I'll never stop making them. I'll definitely continue this process to try to improve your learning experience. Now, obviously, they wanted us to do Zoom meetings. First day of school, Zoom tanked. So I'm glad I'm making these videos for you because I want you to have the best opportunities to have success. I want you to be able to have everything you need. And these videos allow you to explore your education at your own time pace. Do you learn better at night? You learn better at day? You learn better at 3 o'clock in the morning after you've just gotten back from a night of enjoying yourself? I don't know. And frankly, it's not for me to decide. So that's why I like to make these videos for you so that you can learn when you learn best. Having a Zoom meeting at a specific time, I mean, you're already suffering because you're taking an online course that I'm supposed to be teaching you face to face. I would much rather be in front of you right now and have you in front of me providing me with 95% of communication, which is nonverbal. I can tell when you're bored. I can tell when the class materials are getting kind of perplexing. I can see the looks on all my students' faces, and I miss that. We're already dealing with a challenge, and I don't want to make this any more challenging for you. So that's why these videos are designed for you to work at your own pace. You can pause them, you can go back to them, you can write stuff down, you can ask me questions. I answer questions from my students all day long. Every chance I get, I go online and look to find my students' questions and we'll respond to those. So with that, I hope you enjoyed the first lecture. I hope you got a lot out of this, and I hope that we have a wonderful semester. Ask me your questions. Don't wait on them for the night before your paper or your presentation are due. Ask me questions, and I'm always happy to answer them. So again, william.vandyke@csusb.edu, and I'm always grateful for your questions, your participation, and I hope this class is something that you really enjoy. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and sign out, but make sure that you read through the PowerPoint. You can watch the video and the PowerPoint simultaneously, hopefully. The videos are designed to be watched on, I actually tested them. They worked on a flip phone the other day, so you can watch them on your phone and have your computer up where you're looking at the slides simultaneously, or even have just the audio playing. from the video through YouTube and having the PowerPoints up. So the PowerPoints are all on Blackboard, and the videos will be disseminated to you through announcements. Because Blackboard's just not working all that well right now for downloading and uploading videos. So with that, have a wonderful day. Again, this video is designed for Thursday, so this is going to be the last video that you'll get for this week. But each week you're going to get at least 2 more videos from me. Okay, so have a wonderful day, and we'll be meeting soon. Thank you. Bye.